The airport terminal was a mess of noise and movement. Announcements blared over the PA system, children cried as parents hurried them along, and the clatter of suitcase wheels on the polished floors created a kind of background music that no one really noticed anymore. Businessmen in tailored suits barked into phones. Tourists clustered near the gates, clutching passports and neck pillows, eyes darting between the flight screens and the slowly moving lines. In the middle of it all, there was a man standing quietly at the entrance to the first-class boarding lane. He wasn't dressed the way you'd expect someone in that line to be. No suit, no designer labels, no polished shoes that looked like they belonged in a showroom window. He wore a plain, olive green jacket that had clearly seen better days, comfortable sneakers, and dark jeans that had a faint scuff on one knee. He carried a canvas backpack that sagged slightly at the bottom, like it had been packed and repacked too many times. Most people didn't give him a second glance. Except for the ones who did. If they really looked, if they stopped rushing for just a second and noticed, they might have recognized the quiet composure in his expression. The soft, almost imperceptible smile. The eyes that took everything in without rushing to judgment or reaction. That man was Jackie Chan. He stood patiently in line, boarding pass in one hand, the other lightly gripping the strap of his backpack. There was no entourage around him, no assistant juggling his things, no fuss. It was almost like he wanted to blend in, and for the most part, he did. But not for everyone. 2 passengers behind him was Nolan Avery. Nolan was the kind of man who took up space without even trying. Late 40s, broad-shouldered, square-jawed. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that screamed Italian tailoring and shoes that looked like they could blind you under the right lighting. His watch was a gleaming statement piece that he kept adjusting just enough to make sure people noticed it. You could smell his cologne before you even saw him, something sharp and spicy that insisted on announcing his presence before he opened his mouth. Nolan had noticed Jackie immediately. Not because he recognized him, but because he didn't look like he belonged there. First class, Nolan muttered, half to himself, half to the woman beside him who was politely ignoring him. Standards are slipping. Jackie heard him. Of course, he did. But he said nothing, adjusting the strap on his backpack and stepping forward as the line moved. It was the smallest gesture, but somehow it annoyed Nolan more. By the time they were at the gate, Nolan's curiosity, or maybe it was something less generous, got the better of him. "You in the right line, buddy?" he asked with an easy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Economy's back there." Jackie turned slightly to look at him, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "This is my line," Jackie replied simply. His voice was calm, without any challenge or defensiveness. Just a statement of fact. Nolan chuckled under his breath and shook his head like he couldn't believe it. "Hell," he said, waving his ticket toward the gate agent, "guess they really will let anyone up here these days." Jackie said nothing else. But the gate agent smiled warmly when she took Jackie's boarding pass, glancing at him with the faintest flicker of recognition. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Chan," she said softly. Nolan didn't seem to notice that part. He was already halfway down the jet bridge, adjusting his cufflinks. And when Jackie walked onto the plane, seat 1A waiting for him, Nolan was already seated in 1B. When he saw who was sitting next to him, Nolan actually laughed. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. But Jackie just smiled that quiet, gentle smile of his and settled in without a word. And that's where it all began. The first few minutes after they both sat down passed in silence, but it was not a comfortable one. Nolan shifted in his seat, adjusting his belt as though the fit of the leather had suddenly become irritating. He tugged at his cuffs again, checked his watch twice, and made a point of sighing as he opened the menu of in-flight drinks tucked into the armrest. Jackie, on the other hand, appeared completely unaffected by his surroundings. He sat upright but relaxed, his hands resting lightly on his knees, his breathing steady. His backpack was carefully stowed under the seat in front of him, and he had nothing else with him but a small paperback book, which he hadn't yet opened. Instead, he just sat, watching the slow shuffle of other passengers making their way to their seats. Nolan wasn't used to being ignored. He was the sort of man who expected his presence to create an effect, whether that was attention, admiration, or envy. The quiet man in seat 1A didn't give him any of it. Nolan found himself glancing sideways again. He was trying to figure it out. There was something about the guy. The way he sat there like it was the most normal thing in the world to be in first class dressed like he was headed for a hardware store. No Rolex, no briefcase, not even a phone in his hand. It didn't add up. So, Nolan said, making his voice casual but sharp enough to slice through the quiet. "What do you do?" He didn't wait for an answer before adding, "Because I gotta tell you, I've been trying to guess since we got in line back there." Jackie turned his head slowly. His expression was polite but neutral. "I work in film," he said. Nolan nodded like he'd expected something vague. "Film," he repeated. "What, like crew? Gaffing? Grip?" He paused, smirking. "You a stuntman or something?" There was no reaction for a second, then Jackie gave a small nod. "Sometimes." Nolan laughed lightly, shaking his head as he took a long sip of his drink. "Figures," he said. "Nothing wrong with that. Hard work, I bet. A lot of guys bust their asses for years on that side of things. No shame in it." He said it like he was offering comfort, though no one had asked for it. "Still, must have gotten lucky to be up here," he added, his tone still just light enough to pass as casual, but it wasn't casual. It was deliberate. He was prodding. Jackie didn't answer. He picked up his paperback and turned to the first page as though the conversation was over. It took Nolan a minute to realize that it was. They were taxiing down the runway before Nolan spoke again. This time his voice was lower, less performative. "I get it, he said. "You work hard. You want a little taste of how the other half lives. Nothing wrong with treating yourself once in a while. My wife says I'm too hard on people sometimes, but I think it's good to be honest." Jackie didn't look up from his book. The plane lifted into the sky, smooth and steady, and once they leveled off, the flight attendant appeared with the drinks cart. Nolan ordered a scotch, neat, and made a point of complimenting the brand selection. "Nothing but the best up here," he said as he took his glass, flashing a practiced smile. Jackie asked for hot tea. "Just tea. No preferences, no requests." As the attendant handed over the small white cup, Nolan raised his glass. "To first," he said, looking directly at Jackie, waiting for him to acknowledge the toast. Jackie nodded slightly but didn't lift his cup. A few more minutes passed. Nolan sipped his drink. Jackie sipped his tea. "I worked for this," Nolan said, his voice lower again, but still carrying enough weight to suggest he wanted to be heard. "Built my own company from the ground up. Not a penny from family, no handouts, no shortcuts. You know what it's like to work 70-hour weeks? You ever sit in a boardroom with guys waiting for you to fail just so they can eat you alive?" He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "This seat? I earned it. Every inch." Jackie looked up from his book, meeting his gaze. "That's good," he said quietly. "I hope it's brought you peace." For the first time, Nolan's mouth twitched, as though he wasn't sure if he'd heard a compliment or a criticism. "Peace," he repeated, and then shook his head. "Peace doesn't build empires." Jackie didn't reply. He turned a page in his book. The silence stretched again, but Nolan wasn't finished. He leaned back in his seat and let out a breath. Most guys who make it up here, they show it. That's how you keep your place. You show you belong." He looked at Jackie's shoes, then at the old canvas backpack. "People don't respect you if you don't show them why they should." Jackie closed his book gently and set it on his lap. "Respect isn't something you demand," he said. "It's something you offer." Nolan smirked, but his fingers tightened around the glass. "That's a nice line," he said. "Real wise." He drained his drink in one motion. "But that's not how the world works." Jackie said nothing. The flight attendant returned to collect empty glasses, her eyes flickering between the two men, but she didn't interrupt. She didn't have to. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had changed. Other passengers noticed, though they tried not to look directly. People hear things. They feel them. Nolan signaled for another drink, and when the attendant handed it to him, he didn't thank her. Jackie picked up his tea again and sipped it slowly. There was no tension in his posture, no hint of defensiveness. But there was something in his eyes now. Not anger. Not even disappointment. Just patience. As if he had all the time in the world for people to figure things out. The flight continued smoothly. The hum of the engines, the quiet murmur of conversations elsewhere in the cabin, the muted clink of glasses being cleared away. But Nolan was no longer comfortable in his seat. He glanced sideways again. "What's your name, anyway?" he asked. Jackie looked at him calmly. "Jackie," he said. Nolan frowned slightly. "Jackie," he repeated. "Just Jackie." "That's enough," Jackie said. Nolan chuckled under his breath, but it sounded thinner this time. "Right," he said, turning forward again. He didn't speak again for a while, but his fingers kept tightening on the armrest. And he didn't know yet, but something inside him had already started to shift. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight moved into its steady rhythm. Passengers settled into their seats, the murmur of quiet conversations faded, and the occasional click of a seatbelt buckle echoed softly. Nolan sat stiffly beside Jackie, his jaw tense as he pretended to focus on the in-flight entertainment screen in front of him. He scrolled through the options without selecting anything, his finger hovering pointlessly over the display. Every so often, his eyes darted sideways, but Jackie didn't move. He remained still, his hands resting on the closed paperback, his breathing even. If he noticed Nolan watching him, he gave no indication. It was Nolan who broke the silence again, though this time his voice was quieter, less performative. "You don't say much, do you?" he asked, not bothering to hide the irritation creeping into his tone. Jackie turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, but said nothing. Nolan shook his head once, then exhaled slowly through his nose. "You know, in my experience, people who stay quiet usually don't have anything worth saying." His voice was calm, but there was something tight beneath it, like he was holding back something sharper. Jackie's response came without any sign of annoyance or defense. "And in my experience," he said, "the ones who talk the most often say the least." There was a beat of silence after that. Nolan leaned back against his seat, staring at the screen without really seeing it. He tapped the armrest with his fingers, a restless, repetitive motion he probably didn't even notice. Jackie remained as he was, not looking for an argument but not avoiding it either. The tension didn't escalate, but it hung there between them, a quiet pressure neither of them addressed. A little while later, dinner service began. The flight attendants moved quietly through the aisle, their practiced efficiency and polite smiles smoothing over the brief interruptions as trays were handed out and drinks refilled. Nolan accepted his meal with a tight nod, choosing the most expensive option on the menu. He made a point of commenting on the wine selection to the attendant, using words like vintage and body in notes, with the tone of someone who wanted everyone around him to hear. Jackie, on the other hand, simply asked for rice and vegetables, along with another cup of tea. When the attendant asked if he'd like something more substantial, he thanked her and declined without explanation. Nolan watched this quietly at first, then scoffed softly, shaking his head. "Man, you really don't know how to enjoy yourself, do you?" he said. Jackie glanced at him, his face calm but with a faint crease in his brow, as though Nolan's observation wasn't entirely accurate but not worth correcting. "You're sitting in first class," Nolan continued, gesturing broadly with his fork. "You should act like it. Live a little. Order the steak, get the better wine. Hell, they've got caviar if you ask for it." He said this as though he was offering a favor, some piece of valuable advice Jackie had somehow missed. Jackie placed his chopsticks carefully on the edge of the tray and folded his hands loosely. "I don't need more than this," he said quietly. "It's enough." Nolan let out a short laugh. "Enough," he repeated, as if the word tasted strange. "That's the problem with people who settle. They don't even realize how small they're thinking." He pointed to the other passengers in first class. "You think they're up here because they settled?" "No. They aimed higher. They wanted more." Jackie nodded, as though he understood the reasoning, but didn't agree with it. "Wanting more is fine," he said. "But if you aren't careful, it turns into needing more. And then it's never enough." Nolan didn't answer right away. He stabbed a piece of steak with more force than necessary, chewing it as if the conversation required an intermission. His mind was clearly working through something, though he wouldn't admit it out loud. After a few more bites, he set his fork down with a quiet clatter. "You're pretty sure of yourself," he said. "But I've met a lot of men who said things like that. None of them made it very far." Jackie picked up his cup of tea, taking a slow sip before responding. Maybe they made it far enough. The reply wasn't what Nolan wanted to hear. He shook his head again, this time with less amusement and more disbelief. "You really think like that?" he asked. "You really believe all that simplicity stuff? That's not how you get ahead." Jackie didn't speak right away. He studied Nolan for a moment before placing the tea back on the tray. "What makes you think I'm trying to get ahead?" he asked. The question was quiet but direct, and for the first time, Nolan didn't have an immediate answer. They ate in silence after that. The meal trays were cleared, and the lights dimmed further as passengers prepared to sleep or relax. Nolan leaned his seat back with a sharp motion, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Jackie remained upright, his hands resting again on his knees, his gaze focused out the window. They flew through darkness, the sky outside empty except for the faint glow of the wing light. An hour passed before Nolan spoke again. His voice was different now, lower, less sharp. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" he asked. There was no arrogance in the question, just curiosity. Jackie turned his head, meeting his eyes. "No," he said simply. Nolan exhaled, almost relieved. "I thought maybe you did," he said. "And that's why you were acting like this." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I've been on the cover of magazines. Business once. Started my first company at 28, sold it for more than most people make in 5 lifetimes. I've spoken at conferences all over the world. People listen when I talk. They call me for advice. My name gets me tables at restaurants most people can't even get on the waiting list for. He said this not to impress, but as though listing facts he wanted to remind himself of. Jackie nodded once, politely. That's a lot, he said. Nolan shrugged. Yeah, it is. He stared ahead for a while before speaking again. But lately, I've been wondering why it doesn't feel like enough. Jackie didn't answer right away. He waited, as if giving Nolan the space to hear his own words for the first time. Then he said, maybe it isn't about having more. Maybe it's about needing less. Nolan didn't argue. He didn't scoff or laugh. He just sat there, staring at the sea back in front of him, his expression unreadable but less sure than it had been earlier. The flight attendant came by to offer dessert, but both men declined. For the rest of the flight, neither of them spoke. But Nolan stopped adjusting his watch. And when Jackie picked up his book again, Nolan didn't glance sideways anymore. He stared straight ahead, thinking about things he hadn't considered in a long time. The flight had reached the halfway point when the quiet was broken again. The cabin light stayed low, most passengers either asleep or pretending to be. Nolan wasn't doing either. His seat was reclined, but his posture was too tense to suggest rest. His hands stayed clasped in his lap, his fingers moving slightly as though working through an invisible problem. Jackie sat beside him as he had for most of the flight, calm and steady, reading a few pages at a time from the same paperback, occasionally glancing out the window at nothing in particular. For a long stretch of time, they had coexisted without speaking. It wasn't the same heavy silence as before. Something had shifted, though Nolan couldn't quite understand what. Eventually, Nolan straightened his seat and cleared his throat. He didn't look at Jackie, but he was clearly speaking to him. You've been doing this a while, he said. The flying. First class. He let the statement hang, waiting for a reaction. Jackie didn't look away from his page. For many years, he said. Nolan gave a short nod as though that confirmed something he had already guessed. And nobody ever told you that you should make more of it? His tone was quieter, but there was still an edge of disbelief. You could be getting something more out of this. Status. Recognition. People remembering who you are. You just sit there like none of it matters. Jackie closed the book and set it down on the armrest. He considered Nolan for a moment before answering. That's because it doesn't matter to me. The words weren't defensive. They were said plainly, without hesitation. Nolan watched him carefully, his brow furrowed as if he was trying to decide whether Jackie was telling the truth or just very good at pretending. You don't care if anyone notices you? He asked. You don't care if they think you don't belong here? I don't need them to think anything, Jackie replied. I belong here because I bought the ticket. That's enough. Nolan shifted again, his hands gripping the armrest briefly before relaxing. People like to know who they're sitting next to, he said. They like to know who's in their world. Jackie nodded once. Maybe, but I don't need them to know me. Nolan sat back again, staring at the ceiling for a moment. His breathing was slower now, but his mind was clearly still turning things over. I always thought that was the point, he said. You work for something, you get it, and then you make sure everyone knows you got it. Otherwise, what's the point? Jackie answered without any delay. Maybe the point isn't for everyone to know. Nolan exhaled through his nose, rubbing his hand over his jaw. You think it's that simple? I think it can be, Jackie said. They sat quietly again after that. The cabin remained still, the sounds of the engine steady and unchanging. After some time, a flight attendant approached their row and leaned in slightly toward Jackie. She spoke in a low voice, careful not to disturb anyone else nearby. Mr. Chan, she said, the captain wanted to let you know that everything's arranged for your arrival. And he sends his regards. Nolan turned sharply toward Jackie, his mouth slightly open. Chan? He asked, but the question was more like a statement. He was processing it even as he spoke. Jackie Chan? Jackie looked at him without surprise. Yes. Nolan stared at him, his face blank for a moment. Then it shifted, his eyes widening slightly as if a puzzle he hadn't realized he was solving had just clicked into place. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out immediately. He cleared his throat and tried again. I didn't recognize you, he said. I mean, you didn't say. I didn't need to, Jackie replied. Nolan nodded slowly, still watching him. I've seen your movies, he said after a pause. A lot of them. When I was a kid. His voice was quieter now, without its earlier sharpness. Jackie gave a small nod. Thank you. For a while, neither of them spoke again. Nolan seemed unsure what to do with himself. He ran a hand over his face and then rested it on his knee, tapping lightly against the fabric of his trousers. Finally, he exhaled and leaned forward slightly. "You could have told me who you were," he said. "It wasn't an accusation, just an observation." "I didn't think it was important," Jackie said. "You treated me a certain way because of what you saw. My name wouldn't have changed that." Nolan pressed his lips together, looking down at his hands. "Maybe it would have," he said quietly. "Maybe it shouldn't have, but it would have." Jackie didn't respond right away. Then he said, "Now you know. But that doesn't change what's true." Nolan nodded again. He stayed quiet, but it was a different kind of silence. Not defensive, more reflective. After a moment, he leaned back into his seat, staring at the back of the chair in front of him. "I didn't think I had anything to learn on this flight," he said after a while. "I thought I was doing fine." Jackie gave a faint nod, but didn't say anything else. He reached down and picked up his book again, thumbing through the pages to find his place. Nolan didn't interrupt him this time. He sat there quietly, thinking about the conversation, thinking about the way he had behaved before he knew who was sitting beside him, the things he had said, the assumptions he had made, and the fact that Jackie had said almost nothing in return except for what was necessary. He wasn't used to that. He wasn't sure how to feel about it. But for the first time in a long while, Nolan Avery wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just sat there, looking out the window at the clouds. And he didn't say another word until the plane began its descent. The announcement from the cockpit broke the quiet that had settled over the cabin, informing the passengers that they were beginning their descent into Tokyo. Seatbelts clicked back into place. Window shades were pushed open. The cabin crew moved through the aisles with mechanical precision, checking latches, securing trays, and offering the same polite instructions they had delivered countless times before. Nolan didn't hear most of it. He was sitting upright, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed forward, but his mind was somewhere else. Jackie remained calm beside him, adjusting his seat without a word, placing his book neatly into his backpack, and offering a faint nod when the flight attendant thanked him for his cooperation. Nolan glanced at Jackie again, his eyes different from earlier. He wasn't analyzing anymore. He wasn't trying to place him in a category or decide whether he belonged in the space they shared. He wasn't sure what he was thinking, but the confidence he carried at the beginning of the flight was no longer there in the same way. What had filled its place wasn't regret exactly. It was something closer to understanding, though Nolan would not have been able to name it even if asked. He cleared his throat softly, shifting in his seat, waiting for the right moment to say something. "I didn't expect this," Nolan said finally. His voice was quieter than it had been for most of the flight, steady but without the usual certainty. "I thought you were just, I don't know, someone who wandered into a seat like this." Jackie looked at him with the same calm expression he'd worn for most of the flight. "And if I had been?" he asked. Nolan exhaled slowly, holding the breath for a moment before answering. "I guess I would have had to deal with that," he said. He didn't add anything else, and Jackie didn't push him to. They sat in silence again for several minutes, the subtle adjustments of landing filling the space between them. Wheels lowering, flaps adjusting, the ground coming closer. When the plane finally touched down, there was the usual collective release of breath from the passengers. Some clapped softly, others powered on their phones, and a few exchanged quiet words with the people beside them. Nolan didn't move at first. His hands stayed where they were, fingers pressed together, his gaze fixed on the back of the seat in front of him. As they taxied toward the gate, Nolan finally spoke again. "I've spent most of my life making sure no one ever doubted I belonged in places like this," he said. "Even when I knew they did. Especially then." He rubbed his hand over his face, like he was trying to clear something he couldn't quite describe. "And it worked. I build a reputation. People respect me. They look at me and they see success." Jackie listened, saying nothing. Nolan wasn't even sure if he was looking at him anymore. It didn't seem to matter. "But you just sat there," Nolan continued. "Didn't need to prove anything. Didn't have to show it. And you had more respect from this cabin in 2 hours of silence than I've ever had shouting my name at people." He shook his head. "I don't get how you do that." Jackie finally spoke. His voice was as even as before, as if the words were simple facts rather than something meant to impress. "People decide who they are long before others notice them," he said. "When you know who you are, you don't need anyone to confirm it." Nolan took a long breath. He let that settle in, realizing how far it was from how he had lived his life. Everything he had built was designed to keep reminding other people who he was. The houses, the cars, the public speaking engagements, the suits. Every day of his life had been about controlling the image. If he stopped, if he went quiet, he wasn't sure what was left. When the plane finally reached the gate, The seatbelt signs turned off with a familiar chime. Passengers around them rose quickly, eager to grab their bags and make their way off the plane. Nolan remained seated, watching Jackie stand slowly, reaching for his backpack from under the seat. It was worn at the edges. A few stitches looked like they had been repaired by hand. There was nothing special about it, and yet Nolan found himself staring at it longer than he expected to. As Jackie slung the bag over his shoulder, he turned to Nolan one last time. "It was good talking to you," he said. Nolan nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "It was." He paused. "I was wrong about you." Jackie gave a small, polite smile. "You were wrong about yourself," he said. "That's more important." Nolan didn't have a reply to that. He sat there as Jackie stepped into the aisle and joined the slow movement of passengers exiting the plane. Nolan watched him for a moment, then finally rose to his feet and reached for his own carry-on. As he stood there waiting for the line to move, he felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment in himself, though it was close. It was more like an acceptance of something he had been ignoring for a long time. He wasn't sure what to do with it yet, but he wasn't in a hurry to dismiss it. When Nolan stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he saw Jackie standing quietly a few feet away. A couple of people had recognized him by then. One woman approached, speaking softly, and Jackie smiled at her, nodding as he signed something for her without any rush. Another man stood nearby, asking for a photo. Jackie agreed, positioning himself carefully to make sure the man was comfortable in the shot. Nolan watched this from a distance. There was no performance in what Jackie was doing. No effort to draw attention. It was just simple courtesy. Nolan turned away and started walking toward baggage claim, but his pace was slower than usual. He kept thinking about what Jackie had said. About knowing who you are before anyone else decides. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, but for the first time, he realized he wanted to figure it out. Not for the business. Not for the reputation. Not even for the applause. Just for himself. As he walked, he thought about all the times he had worked to be noticed, all the times he had pushed to be in control of how others saw him. He thought about how quickly it had unraveled during one flight sitting next to someone who didn't say much at all. He reached the baggage carousel and waited in silence. No one recognized him here. No one approached him. And for once, Nolan didn't mind. He picked up his suitcase when it arrived and walked out of the terminal, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but it felt like the start of something better.